Okay, cool. So for our first session, we're just gonna kind of like go like we're just gonna talk. I have some questions for you, but it's non-formal. That's what I was looking for. It's non-formal because this is the first one, and I want to know what works versus what doesn't, rather than like try and be very productive.
Yeah.
Um, okay, so I am Josh. I run the nonprofit I run is called the Hyperlight News. So on one hand we do um, we it's like news media like CNN, but kind of not evil. Um, and so because I feel that one of the reasons everyone's going crazy in the U.S. is they don't know what's going on outside of the U.S. and how they can help. So instead of having all these ways to be productive and use your charisma and personality for good, we're just like trying to polish off the last little bits of problems that we have in the U.S. In school, they were called the lawnmower generation. Like you're familiar with the helicopter parent generation, right? And the latchkey generation.
Yes.
Okay, yeah. So now we're at the lawnmower generation, where it's like, what little problems are left? We have to get rid of them. Um,
That sounds about right. Yeah.
and then the other half is I want to promote the aspects of Christianity that are about actually going out and do Christian stuff rather than just like going to church and going home. So the I have a I call that part of the ministry the Paladin Core. So the idea is to get people to go out and start praying for others, to get people out to go feeding the poor and start economies. Because throughout, from what missionary work I've done, I've seen a lot of miracles. So the idea that God doesn't do miracles is a completely foreign concept to me. Um, I've seen them all my life. So okay, so you've got three kids. What's your background and what got you into homeschooling? And talk as
So,
long or as little as you want. It's free form.
so my background is in education. So I went to college to become a teacher. I had wanted to be a teacher from the time I was like in third or fourth grade. I loved school, and I had some amazing teachers that just inspired me. So got my degree in child development, and I started in college working in the public schools as a special ed aide.
Oh wow.
And
Okay.
then eventually I was able to get a job teaching, and that was also in special education as well. So, special ed teacher resource inclusion, which means I either went into the general ed classroom to assist my kids, or they would come to me for 30 minutes to an hour a day for specialized instruction in reading and math. So, typically, kids with learning disabilities, high functioning autism, and behavior disorders. And when my first daughter was born, so my husband also became a teacher. He didn't intend to be a teacher, but he decided that's what he was going to do. So we were both in our second or third year of teaching, and our oldest was at least a year old. We were both thinking about homeschooling. And my husband actually approached me. He was like, "What do
Really?
you think about homeschooling?" And I was like, "I've been thinking about it." And the reason behind that is because we were both the kind of kids that did well in school.
Mm-hmm.
Um, we just did well. We didn't have to struggle. We made A's and B's. My husband was like in the gifted program and all that. So we enjoyed school. And what we were seeing with these kids going on was not how we remembered school. So he was at middle schools and I was at the elementary school. And seeing all of that, like a lot of the standardized testing, I felt really, really was hindering education a lot. Um, and we're just like, we don't want that for our kids. We want them to have more opportunities and kind of just what we were seeing in kids. We were like, we don't want our kids to grow up this way. We don't want them to be surrounded by, kids that, in the nice way would be calling them knuckleheads. Um, because kids would just say and do things, especially at the elementary level, I found quite disturbing and inappropriate. And I was like, I don't want my kid exposed to those things. So that's what led us down the path of homeschooling.
Okay, cool. Give me just 1 second now. I'm going to test the video. Like, no, I guess if you're up for it, if you have the energy, if you want to rehash what you just said, otherwise we can loop back to it in a bit.
Um, yeah, I can rehash it and fine with me.
Okay, so we had technical difficulties for anyone that hopefully watches this in the future. But the question was, how did you get into homeschooling, right? And what's your kind
Yes.
of background?
Yes. So my background is in education. Went to college to be a teacher after I was inspired by my teachers in elementary school, and I was the kid that loved school. And while I was in college, I began working in the public schools as a special ed aide. And so I got my degree in child development and then started teaching in the public schools as a special ed teacher. And what I did was resource and inclusion. So I had kids with mostly learning disabilities, high functioning autism, and sometimes other behavior disorders. And either I would go into the classroom to assist them, or they would come to my room for 30 minutes to an hour to work on math or reading skills, trying to catch them up to where they're closer to their peers and helping close those gaps. And my husband was also became a teacher in middle school. And after our first daughter was born, so somewhere around our second or third year of teaching, we started thinking about homeschooling. So my husband actually approached me and he said, "What do you think about homeschooling?" And I was like, "Yeah, I've been thinking about that." And the reason we wanted to do that is because we were not liking what we were seeing in the public schools, because it was not the way we remembered schools as kids. I mean, we were the kind of kids that loved school. A's, B's, it came pretty easy for us. My husband was like even in the gifted program. And from my end, I was seeing a lot of teaching to the test. So standardized testing I felt was way different for kids today than it was in my generation in the 90s and early 2000s. And my husband being on the middle school end, he was seeing other things. So that was kind of our initial thought with our oldest daughter was like, well, we don't want to put her in this environment. We don't want this educational experience for her. And we figured we can offer her a more well-rounded education. And then just seeing a lot of how the kids acted and behaved and a lot of the things that they knew that were just completely inappropriate, that we didn't want our kids exposed to that in that way. So that was what ultimately pushed us to homeschool our kids.
Okay, wow, yeah. So how long have you been homeschooling then?
This would be our third, going into our third year.
Oh, okay. So you're still, and you, may I ask how old your kids are?
So my oldest is 7. I don't really count pre-K as homeschooling
Sure.
because we weren't very formal. It was
Okay.
very laid back.
Um, yeah, so I'll cut this part out if it's not something you want associated with yourself, just the fact that we're both on screen. But yeah, I wasn't as much of a proponent of everyone homeschooling as I am now. I don't think like everyone has to homeschool, but after this incident, it really pushed me in that direction to like homeschooling is a much richer outcome for your kids. So I was babysitting my best friend's stepdaughter. Uh, I was trying to move back to California, and rather than pay daycare $1,000, they're like, "Hey, will you watch our daughter and save us $1,000?" And I was like, "Oh yeah, sure, absolutely." And this girl was just always getting in fights, always getting detention, always getting suspended, like just major problems. And but she kind of had the brain of an adult. If you've ever seen those kind of kids that can be really monstrous because they really keep up with you and get what's going on. And finally, I look at her and I say, we'll call her Jane to, so I'm not using her actual name. I was like, "Jane, like what is going on that you are in trouble all the time and picking fights?" And she looks at me and she goes, "Well, Becky said I was having sex with Johnny." And I said, "No, I'm not having sex with him." And then my other friend came up and said, "Yeah, well, that's because you're sucking his dick and sucking all these other guys' dicks." And I was like, "No, I'm not sucking anyone's dick. I'm not having sex with anyone." And I just stopped her because this was a 6-year old. This was a 6-year-old. Yeah. And like, it was one of those few moments where it felt like the devil was like raking a finger across my spine. I was just like, what horror have I just walked into where this is coming out of like a 6-year-old's mouth? So I was like, nope, that's it. People need to homeschool because 6-year-olds should not be coming home and having to deal with this. Um,
Uh, yeah, we had an incident with a fourth grader. He wasn't on my caseload, but I heard about it, and he asked another fourth grade girl if she wanted to meet him in the bathroom to have sex. And I'm just like, you never heard that kind of stuff when I was in elementary school.
yeah,
And I grew up in just one community over from where I was teaching. So it's not like it was, I'm teaching in some other place. Like this is in the general county that I grew up in.
yeah, I grew up in Orange County, California, or I went to school in Orange County. I grew up in LA, and albeit I went to school in the late '90s, I graduated in '99, but none of us really pushed for that. Like we weren't pushy for sex. I mean, every guy was hoping for it, but he didn't like. That wasn't like the dialogue wasn't that graphic. Every guy was a guy, but it wasn't like it wasn't that. Um, so where do you hope to take homeschooling? Are you going to go through high school? Are you going to see where you're going with it? Like, is there an ultimate hope?
My plan is to do it all the way through. I think initially when my husband and I talked about homeschooling, we were just talking maybe the first few years.
Mm,
So I could lay a solid foundation and guarantee that they were actually learning things in a non-stressful environment. But then the more I became aware of what even would happen at the secondary level, as well as what I began learning about the history of compulsory education, and I was just like, and I began seeing things from a Christian perspective as well. I kind of was more convicted about that as a Christian. I should not be putting my kids in that environment. So it was that idea of, nope, we're going to do this all the way through. I mean, I wouldn't be opposed to private school if that was ever an option down the road, but
make sure it's a good private school. Most of the
yeah,
schools I went to in California were the private schools weren't better, and I don't know
yeah,
that the private school kids were better.
yeah, no, I've heard stories about private school kids. So it would not be the ideal option, but there's two private schools in our community, and one I know a lot of people. So it's the other one, I don't know anyone that goes there, so I wouldn't feel as comfortable.
Yeah, so it was interesting. My best friend Jacob and I both grew up Christian, and we both took to it. So we grew up like, you know, as Christians, not people who just say they believe in Jesus. Um, and he did okay, and I did okay, but I felt like that was kind of it. Like being Christian in a secular world is tricky at best, but the secular world seems to have gotten combative,
Mm-hmm.
and that's kind of weird to me. That's a lot of burden on a kid's shoulders, I feel.
Oh yeah.
Um, but I think I told you before. Growing up homeschooled, it was never hard to say like no to drugs, no to um, random sex, no to anything peer pressure. I just be like no, and it would baffle a lot of people. But when you grow up around adults, you act like an adult, think like an adult. Um, do you worry about any of the shortcomings? Not going to dances, not playing sports, not meeting girls as often.
Um, I think the only thing I kind of feel a little disappointed in is I was in marching band in school,
Mm-hmm.
and I still really enjoy going to football games to work marching band. So I think the only thing is I feel like there may be those few experiences that they're going to miss out on, but I'm thinking of, long term do those experiences really matter in life? Do they shape who they are? I don't think my marching band experience had a huge impact on my life other than I have an appreciation for marching band competitions and knowing, hey, they did a really good job. But I know my child can still learn to play a musical instrument, and I'm hoping she'll have more opportunities than I really did, because when I think about it, I was still very limited. When you're in public school, you're still very limited what you can do. Well, I hated sports, so I didn't want to do that. So I had to participate in PE. And I feel like there's enough out there, especially in the community we live in, that there's still things for them to do, but they're still little now. So we will kind of have to see once they get to those teen years, um, what those interests are going to be, and hopefully help them to continue, pursuing those.
Okay. And now the big question, because homeschooling is so terrifying to a lot of moms, what are the really big fears that you have now, and what are the really big fears that you maybe had in the beginning that you don't have now?
I would say my biggest fear is, am I going I don't want to ever have children that just resent me because of the way I parented. I think that's my biggest fear, is that I don't parent them well enough, and that they become adults and they just, you know, mom didn't do this right and we don't have a good relationship or something. Because I feel like when I'm around my kids all the time, I didn't know parenting was going to be so hard, because I went from a working mom to a stay-at-home mom, and I had to read parenting books. I had to watch YouTube videos, and I like that's where my greatest weakness is. I can teach a kid to read all day long, but to get me to help me discipline and parent my kids, that's the greatest struggle. So I kind of worry, I think most parents do, that they're going to screw up their kid in some way. And I know my parents did a good job, um, but I wasn't around them all day long either.
True.
They worked, they worked full time, and then we all went to school. So my grandma raised me until I started school. She took care of me while my parents worked. And it was just me. I didn't have any siblings then. So what, I mean, like I said, I think my parents did a really good job. They weren't perfect, but they did really well. So, and I just kind of wonder, what would that have been like if I had been around my mom all day long instead of these few hours in the day, like, would she have wrung my neck kind of thing.
Yeah, I think being around my mom all the time made me kind of stir crazy, because it made it very easy for her to be like, "Oh, can you go take out the trash? Oh, can you go do?" And like, we all have chores. I'm not putting down chores, but I became like an extension of her arm, which will happen around best friend groups, but a best friend can tell their friend no. And it's actually a piece of advice I give to parents: is you're going to be your kid's mom and their best friend, and you need to be careful, because normal kids kind of push back against whatever you say, no matter what level of relationship you have with them. But a homeschool kid will absorb it in full. So if you're their mom and their best friend, whatever you say, they're going to absorb 6 times, instead of pushing back and taking like 25% of one. Um, but yeah, what eventually worked for me was, whenever I acted up, the discipline that my mom worked to is, she'd be like, "You have to do 4 hours of stuff now. Like, it's going to be like cleaning windows or playing with your sister." And that worked really well, because I was really headstrong, but burning my patience was a big like irritation for me. So that chilled me out.
So extra chores, basically.
So it was like hours. It'd be like 4 hours, and then we could kind of talk about what the discipline was, and that really helped. Because it'd be like, "Do you want to do dishes or play with your sister?" And you'd be like, "I guess I'll play Monopoly. Can I play Monopoly with my sister, and that'll take 4 hours?" And my mom would say like, "Okay, yeah, you can play 4 hours. You can play Monopoly." And so that control, because it was like, when you grow up a little adult and parents treat you as a kid, you try to fight back instead of problem solve. Which was my biggest hurdle in high school, actually. When I got there, all the teachers treated us as kids, and everyone ran around like idiot assholes. And I was just looking at everything, and I was like, "What'd you expect? You're talking to us like we're morons. Of course we're going to be morons." Because my homeschool group, when we would go to museums, we'd walk around, we'd be quiet, we'd listen. And I think parents have forgotten that kids like school and like to be educated. Like that's almost like a myth now. Like we liked learning about dinosaurs and science and physics and everything. Like listening and learning. My friend taught himself a year of math in 2 months because he loved it so much. He would just do his math book all day every day. Um, so it's interesting that how much people have forgotten that like what a good cultural standard education is. It's weird.
Oh yeah.
It's weird that now we think like it's something you have to burden yourself through. That was really baffling. I went back to college in my 30s, and I would ask 1,000 questions, and it would irritate all my classmates. And I was like, hey, look, I paid $1,000. Like she works for me. Like I'm not worried about you guys being angry. And my teachers loved it, which shocked everyone, because I was interacting. Um, but yeah, is there any surprise lessons you've learned being a homeschool mom now that you didn't consider? Or...
Um, I think the biggest, and I think it was something I kind of always knew, but it was really seeing how fast my kids could pick something up and completely just quickly move through things, master it right along with ease. I mean, part of it I would balance from like, okay, well, I was a special ed teacher, but I still spent time in the general ed classroom. And I would just see through just totally changing the way I would teach or introduce something and just see my girls just like, they just picked it up so quick. And then the most impressive thing for me was, this idea of copy work. So having kids do a lot of handwriting was, frowned upon in the public schools. Like there's just no point. It doesn't matter if the kid can write well or that they can spell. And it was frustrating when you would have fifth graders or even fourth graders that still could not put a capital and a period at the end of a sentence,
Why
even
was
though
it?
this was grounded into them from the time they were in kindergarten. And so many kids still couldn't do it. And so with my daughter, we were doing this copy work that I had heard about through homeschooling. And she wanted to write a sentence all by herself after we had read Anna Green Gables. And
Whoa!
then I read it aloud to her, and she was very into that book. And she was like, well, I want to write the sentence myself. So I said, okay. And so she wrote the sentence. And like I said, this was first grade. So she put a capital, a period, all her spacing, and then she capitalized the names of the people. I mean, I went to my husband, I was like, look, and he just was like, he goes, I have eighth graders that can't do that. So
It's
it's
interesting. It's interesting because I feel that when there's aggressive, I don't want to say abusive because that has too much connotation to it, but I feel like when your classmates are horrible people, and I'm not trying to judge so much as I'm trying to problem solve because I like to problem solve. When they're horrible people, you have to kind of keep your brain active towards them. And if your teacher's stressed out, you have to keep your brain active towards pleasing your teacher. And then you're trying to work, and you're also like, hungry or thirsty or whatever. That's a lot of like brain power that you don't have access to. Whereas when you're homeschooled, one, you've slept. And I think people
mm-hmm.
forget that. Like when you're homeschooled, you get a full night's sleep no matter what. And that is just the best thing ever when it comes to learning. And then you can be just left alone. Because I feel like teachers try to explain it. When you're homeschooled, it's like, this is what we're doing. And then the parent will just sit there and the kid will look at it and the kid will have questions. And then, like you said, I taught myself math. My mom didn't even help me. I taught myself math all the way up through pre-algebra. And when I finally tested for high school, and I went to one of the best high schools in the U.S., when I tested in, they wanted me to skip into third level math. So they wanted to put me at junior level when I was halfway through junior high level math. Um, so yeah, it's definitely a surprise. Any horror stories yet?
Um, no, I wouldn't say any horror stories yet, other than we hate spelling.
I hated English until I found a teacher that taught me English like math, and now I get A's on my papers, and I used to get F's.
Okay. Yeah.
Um,
Spelling is like nails across the chalkboard with my oldest. She really hates it. So I'm thinking of only doing it once a week because I'm not gonna there's no point in forcing her to try to do something she doesn't want to do
what
that makes her
So the way I
upset.
actually learned spelling was do you know what an MMO is? World of Warcraft. Do you know what World of Warcraft is?
Yes, my brother used to play that.
Okay, so I played World of Warcraft, and whenever I typed, I made myself spell the words correctly. And so after a month of playing World of Warcraft, I had perfect spelling.
Yeah. I think that's like finding what is it the thing that can get her. I mean, she spells okay because she can read and she can translate a lot of that, but you know, you see it as a normal subject. Um,
Probably just put
and
it on.
the way I teach spelling is different than I think the way we did it in the public schools, but she's not digging it. So I'm thinking that's just something we may need to really lay back on until she figures out how she wants to do it on her own.
Also, spelling is kind of brute force. You could work on writing, like creative writing
Mhm.
or anything, and then just have a laptop or a phone next to her so she can check her words as she goes. And then just tell
Yeah.
her to memorize it as she goes. And, that might be a different hemisphere of the brain that's not such a chore.
Mm-hmm.
So for new moms, um, I feel like homeschooling isn't actually as terrifying as you think it is. It's just getting some books and impregnating some knowledge into your kids. Is there much more to it than that? I haven't come at it from the parent side yet. I've been the tutor and the helper and the learner, but not the like overseer.
So what I found, because thankfully I had a whole year before my daughter was in kindergarten.
Mm-hmm.
So I had the opportunity to just read about homeschooling. And I think, and sometimes I worry about like some of the new moms that are jumping in with our community, um, is trying to tell them like, you don't need to do all these things. Focus on, reading, writing, arithmetic, like just start there. Because I think from what I hear from my moms, like I said, I lucked out and was able to spend a year studying homeschooling, and so I started out well. I feel like, but I think a lot of parents just put too much on their plate on what they need their kid to do instead of just focusing on the basics. And I think letting them know that it takes time to build, the routine and the habits. Um, I think coming across Charlotte Mason was a huge game changer. I don't know if you ever heard your mom talk about Charlotte Mason method at all.
Let me write that down. Charlotte Mason. Actually, give me just 5 seconds to make a new file.
Mm-hmm. So I came across her just on YouTube. I was actually looking up unschooling on YouTube, and then somehow Charlotte Mason video popped up. And so she was a British educator in the late 1800s, early 1900s. And so she mainly her main focus was on home education, like training parents and like a governess, um, to go into the home to home educate. But she also still believed in like little schools and things like that. So she has this thing where talks about habit training. So, like I said, she's late 1800s, and how we need to train our children in good habits. And that if we can train them in these habits, basically that's going to reduce a lot of behaviors that you have in kids. Um, so I took that idea with habits. I mean, she ties in a lot of like, moral, um, characteristics of good habits. But I just took that idea and was like, okay, if I want to reduce the behavior and stress in our home, I have to teach my kids these good habits. Um, like cleaning up toys and messes has been the biggest stressor, I felt like. And so we now have a habit of you don't get to watch TV, or we have TV time at 4:30 because that's when I need to get ready for dinner, and I'd like to be uninterrupted. So they get TV time at 4:30 until dinner, and so we practiced, and it's taken a long time to get us here. That playroom has to be completely cleaned up before they can turn on that TV, and they do pretty well at that. And I'll do spot checks every now and then, and I'll be like, "Get back in there," because they're still look at that stuff you shoved in the corner kind of thing. But they just go and do it. Mhm. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Finding what motivates, and right now it's TV, watching Cinderella or whatever. Like that's our because they would be little zombies and sit in front of the TV all day if they were allowed to. So, oh yeah, yeah. Mhm, she's very humble and things like that. Yeah, she's not bad of a character. But the so we have Disney Plus, and the only thing I totally would be fine getting rid of it, to be honest. I would get rid of it. Yeah, but the thing is it has all the terrible Disney movies like Cinderella 2 and Cinderella 3, and these are like they're not good quality programming. I'm not saying they're inappropriate, but I'm like, "This is just terrible TV." Like, this is really like this is not enriching you in any way, and I have noticed in my kids, their favorite show is called Bluey, which if you ask any parent, their kid watches Bluey, and they start imitating things from this show, and I just ask them now, I'm like, "Did you learn that from Bluey?" And they're like, "Yeah." I mean, they think it's funny. I hate the show, but it's cute, but I just hate it. Mhm, mhm. Yeah, I feel like there's, like, certain things, what do you really want to as a parent, you need to figure out where do you wanna draw the line and what are you okay with? There's only a handful of things that I will say, "No, we can't watch this," and they're like, "Why?" And it's like, "Well," I will say, "Well, it's not really appropriate for little girls at your age," or, "You know what? This particular show is not pleasing and honoring to God, so we shouldn't watch this one." I mean, but it's very few things. Like, we'll let our kids watch Back to the Future. It is, they love that, they love Star Wars, they love Jurassic Park, but we did learn with Back to the Future, there's a lot of language in it, and I didn't remember that till we started watching it, my husband and I were like, "Oh," and shit shit's in there several times. So my oldest was like, she was just quoting the movie and she just said it, luckily at home, and we were like, "Okay, that's not a very nice word, can't say that." But I've also noticed that they pick up things that are not good, like saying, like, my daughter just blurted out, "Thank God," and I was like, it was not an appropriate context, and I was like, "Mm, that's not how we thank God." And I was like, "That's almost like using God's name in vain when we just blurt it out like that." We need to make sure that when we say thank God, we're actually thanking Him for our blessings, not just throwing His name out there just because. Um, so there are things like that I know that they pick up on from shows that I'm like, you know, um, same thing with like a lot of OMG stuff is in sometimes shows, and so we have to be like, that's not okay for us to say. Um, but it's a learning thing, and so that's just been probably the most interesting thing about kids and TV shows and what they pick up. I wasn't allowed to say that in school. Yeah, sucks and freaking. I was not allowed to say freaking. Um, but like I said, my parents never had a problem with occasionally throwing out, the S word. Because I mean, the one thing should know about you living in the South, and but especially living with like certain people is, especially the older generation, is that's just like a can be a very common word. Like it's a cuss word, but so many people just say it in their everyday language. Like, oh, so and so was just being a little shit today. Like, kind of thing. So, um, but it's like, it's a cuss word, but people, I feel like just, especially the older generation in the South, just throw that word out there like it's nothing. Hmm. Do you mean as far as like kids' reactions to stressful situations or mental health? Mhm. Um, I don't know if I've either thought about it or have much experience with it. As far as like, you know, having being indwelled with the Holy Spirit while being a teacher and interacting with kids, I know for myself when I'm dealing because I had some very difficult students that had terrible home lives. And I also now I volunteer at the pregnancy center in my community and I teach parenting classes. So I have girls in junior high and high school in my classes sometimes. And that that put a huge that was very heavy on my heart to have some very, very young girls because I'm like, I wouldn't even think of that stuff at that age. And then I have young women that had went through some horrific things when they were kids and teenagers because a lot of them they'll just open up to you. And even when I was a special ed teacher, because I had more intimate relationships with my kids because they were, when it's just me and three other kids with Miss Parks, and we're doing our reading and our math, but man, they just sometimes they want an adult to talk to and just to listen to them sometimes. And a lot of them are open books. Um, and just how they try to tell you things. And then a lot of times because I said my experience is mostly with little kids and how they show you things. Um, so it's probably not exactly answering your question, but it made me think of a time that it was one of those I feel like I'm probably not using the best terms, but it was like I really felt the power of the Holy Spirit one time when I was teaching with a kid that was very troubled. Mom was just not a good mom, and this kid he was the mean kid, and he picked on other kids. Mom just dropped him off at church basically so she could go do her own thing. The church was a babysitter to her, so I knew he believed in God. And it's very taboo to talk about God in school. And this kid he had a horrible day. Like I said, he had a tough home life, and there was really, there's nothing you can do about it. But I knew he went to church. I knew he believed in God because he would ask me, Miss Parks, do you believe in God? Yeah, I believe in God. And he was so awful, and I just pulled him into my room, give him the talk like I do all the time. And I was just thinking in my head, like, God, what do I do with this kid? Because it's just like nothing I can do can fix him. And because he's so troubled. And what it came to my mind was, the forgive him as I have forgiven you, love him as I have loved you. And it was just like, oh, like I'm sitting in front of this 10-year-old boy or 11, fifth grader, and I'm just start crying in front of this kid, which really freaked him out because I think anytime a kid sees an adult cry, it really freaks them out because you're just you're a kid and you're like, there's a grown up crying. I don't know what I'm supposed to do. And I just looked at him and I said, you know how in church you learn that Jesus loves us no matter what we do and he forgives us when we do wrong? And he's like, yeah. I was like, and you know how he loves us? He goes, yeah. And I'm like, well, Jesus loves me when I mess up and make mistakes. And so I want you to know that I love you even though you mess up and make mistakes. And I just kind of always have this deep down hope that little thing I said to that kid, because he was back to his usual shenanigans the next day. But I always hope that little seed is still in that kid, even though he's probably 18 now. Now that I think about it, yeah, he yeah, he could probably be done with school if he made it through school. Um, but I know that's where I know God worked on me as a teacher and as just a person of just that reminder of you can't fix people. And so I take a lot of that to when I'm with these young girls in my parenting classes of these are some really broken young women and teenagers, and I can't I can't fix their issues. And like I said, I've had girls that are in middle school, and what they have to deal with, especially being a pregnant teenager, that's a whole nother set of issues. So I don't know, because I don't know if that really answers your question, but I can't say I have a whole lot of experience other than dealing with broken people and how, you know, God has used me in those ways, to reach those youth as much as possible. Mhm, yeah, mhm, mhm,